I'm Dave Patel. I'm the Associate Dean for the Huntsman School. This Focus Fridays initiative really started about 2.5 years ago from several of our new faculty that said, at a lot of business schools across the country, there are no classes on Fridays to give students a chance to attend all sorts of opportunities about their careers, right? And so we've been working with the USU administration on that, and so we've finally gotten the approval, and you're sitting in the first actual event of our Focus Fridays initiative. We hope that over time, this becomes a great avenue for all of you to explore careers, to sharpen skills, and to aspire to some of the heights that a lot of our alumni and friends have achieved. There's a variety of programming that we're rolling out just this first semester. This leadership forum is one of those, and it's a chance for you to interact with senior executives about what they view are the qualities of leadership. There are industry panels. In fact, there's one today at 11 o'clock in this very venue, where we'll bring in different professionals from different industries. So today it's about the financial services industry, and there'll be 4 professionals from that, and it'll be a moderated session, just like this one. There are lots of workshops throughout the day, specific to careers and career development, so resume writing or interview skills. As we go forward, we hope to offer workshops on specific skills. So for example, you could take a marketing student, could take a workshop on the programming language Python, right? That they may not normally get to take if they're not in computer science or MIS, to be able to add and complement to your skills as a marketing major. So we hope to have workshops to that effect as we roll forward. So I hope that all of you take advantage of these programs on every Friday. All of the information, the entire calendar for every Friday, it's very simple. It's /Focused Fridays, right? huntsman.usu.edu/Focused Fridays. And so with that, let me introduce very briefly our first speaker. So this is our leadership forum every Friday at 10 o'clock. My thought in creating this schedule is that you start off with the very big picture, right? And then you narrow to whatever specific skills or interests you have. So every Friday at 10 o'clock, we're going to talk to a CEO about what they view as what constitutes leadership. I'm excited that we're kicking off the leadership forum with the Dean of the Huntsman School of Business, Doug Anderson. So welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you all.
One of the reasons I'm really excited about starting off with Dean Anderson is he had a really unique experience in the first half of 2016. So let's start with that. Tell us a little bit about what you did from January to June of this year.
I sure will, Dave. But first, I'd just like to say thank you for inviting me to come at the beginning of this session and not during ski season.
Yeah.
But I do note that if you come to the Focused Friday leadership forums, even in ski season, you can still get a half day at Beaver, I think.
That's right.
Okay, so, all right. So I made 2 mistakes when I was an undergraduate here at Utah State. The first was that I didn't read enough history, and the second was that I didn't get a season's pass to Beaver Mountain. The consequence of that is I'm a mediocre historian and also a mediocre skier, but the good news is that you don't have to be particularly good at either of those things in order to enjoy it. So you asked me about this last semester. I was honored to receive a visiting professorship back at Harvard Business School, where I taught during the required first year of the MBA program a course called Leadership and Corporate Accountability. I had started my career teaching at Harvard Business School. I was there roughly a decade, from 1978 till 1988. And so for me, this was the very first time I had been back teaching in the Harvard classroom in 29 years. My colleagues said to me, "Don't worry about it, Doug. It's just like riding a bicycle." And it wasn't just like riding a bicycle. It was like playing competitive tennis and you haven't done it for 25 years. You kind of know the first serve needs to go in and you need to be able to play the baseline, but you've forgotten your muscle memory.
Yeah.
So it was a great learning experience. I had a lot of fun. 93 students in the required section.
About this many?
Yeah, about that. In one of those tiered classrooms, much like the classrooms that we have, very eager, very well prepared students. It was a lot of fun.
And what was the class?
Well, the class was called Leadership and Corporate Accountability, and basically it dealt with the issues that a CEO would deal with, the gray area issues, if you will. The issues that sort of fall between, think of a Venn diagram that would include economic analysis, legal analysis, and ethical analysis. You were looking for the sweet spot where those elements would overlap, and oftentimes it was difficult to make that judgment.
And what would you say was the biggest takeaway for you from teaching that class about leadership?
Well, I would say that I have a takeaway about the students, and then I have a takeaway about the concept. The takeaway that I have about the students is I think this generation of students is genuinely desirous of making good ethical decisions. Now, in the case of the Harvard Business School, one of the cases that we studied was the Enron case, which was, of course, a tremendous disaster. And the guy who was famous for propagating that case, one of the two guys that was famous for that was a guy by the name of Jeff Skilling. Well, Jeff Skilling was a Harvard Business School graduate, not only a Harvard Business School graduate, but he graduated at the top of his class at Harvard Business School. And so naturally there's a sense of, how do we avoid making the same mistakes that a guy like Skilling made? And you don't avoid those mistakes without thinking about the potential pitfalls in advance. And I guess the leadership lesson from that is something that goes back to the Greeks, back to Plato, which is the importance of knowing yourself and doing deep reflection about the challenges that you might face in leadership.
You've been Dean of the Huntsman School for 10 years. You started your 11th year this summer. How has the role changed? And what's your typical day today?
Well,
what did you find yourself at 10 years ago?
10 years ago, I'm going to back up and give a little background to that. I consider myself to be an accidental dean, and I'm going to speak to the students on this. I consider myself sort of to be an accidental dean. I wasn't aspiring to be a dean of a college of business. In fact, when I was invited to become the dean by the President Albrecht, I was happily minding my own business. I literally had a business that I was in love with. It was very profitable, very exciting business. We had started it in 1987, myself and 3 other Harvard Business School colleagues. It was a consulting business. We used education and the case method of instruction as a way to help companies address their most important strategic issues and build the capability to execute a plan of action. And our clients were very large companies. We tended to work with the CEO and his top team closely, and then we would cascade a custom executive development program throughout the corporation, usually hitting 1,000 to 2,000 people in groups of typically about 35 or 40 at a time, and these programs would range from 3 to 5 days in duration. And our clients were all over the world. I went in setting up the company. I told my partners that if it worked out, I intended to move back to Utah in 2 years and live in Utah and run the business from there. In fact, when I was a student here at Utah State University, my parents lived down here on the island, and I would walk down along the boulevard. I'd look out over the south end of this valley and think, this is the most beautiful place in the world. I wonder if there's any way I could live in Utah and and work in Chicago. That was about as far as my imagination would take me. Well, in 1987, it became possible to do something like that. And in fact, from 1987 until I became dean, I did no work for pay to speak of in the state of Utah. Everything was outside of the state. And it was made possible by the dramatic changes in communications and transportation that we've had. So around about 2000, I thought it was about time for me to start giving back to this institution that I love so much. And so I agreed to serve on the USU Research Foundation board. This is the board that oversights the SDL, Space Dynamics Lab, and the Water Research Lab, and so forth. And then, having served on that board for a few years, I was invited to serve on the board of trustees by the governor of the state. And then shortly after that, I was invited to be the vice chairman of the board of trustees. I thought this was the perfect job. Close to the action, no real responsibility. And I was serving on that board when one day I got a phone call from the president inviting me to become the dean. And I can tell you exactly when this was. It was the Tuesday before Thanksgiving in 2005. Can you all remember where you were Tuesday before Thanksgiving in 2005? Well, I was sitting in my home office in Salt Lake City, having just returned from my annual partner meeting with my partners in Boston, which is where our company was headquartered. And I was completely taken by surprise by this invitation, and I said to the president, there's absolutely no way. I'm honored, but there's no way. And one of the reasons I said that was because literally the day before, in our meeting in Boston, my partners and I had addressed a question about what we were going to do for the next 5 years. And that had been a difficult problem for us because all of us at the time were getting to be in our 50s, and we wondered how much longer we wanted to stay in this business. We loved it, but we were doing a tremendous amount of travel. And the question was, is there a legacy here that we're building that we can, be proud of and pass on to another generation, perhaps? We had no interest in capitalizing the business. That's just not the way it worked. And we were having difficulty coming to this judgment because some of our partners, like two of our partners, had already left the firm and had returned to academia. One had gone back to Harvard, another was at Duke. And we could imagine others of our partners also leaving. We had replaced them, but it wasn't easy to find partners that could do exactly what we did. And so we recognized that there were some shutdown costs associated with our practice. And nobody wanted to be the guy that turned out the lights. So I came up with this idea that said, look, if there are costs associated with shutting down this business, then let's just value those costs and we'll escrow that amount of money. Each partner would escrow his portion of that cost of shutting down the business in the firm, and if he left before the expiration of this next 5-year period, then he'd just forfeit that money on some kind of sliding scale. That idea got traction with all of my partners. We turned it over to our attorneys. They wrote it up, made contracts, and we literally signed that agreement not 24 hours before I got the invitation, Dave, from President Albrecht to become the dean. So my mind just wasn't open to the idea of doing it. He, I think, is a pretty wise judge of character, and he said, well, don't say no definitively until you've had a chance to think about it and talk with your wife, Kathy, about it. And I agreed to do that, and over the course of the next month, I kept thinking to myself, why didn't I get this phone call earlier? And at Christmas time, we have a cabin down in Brighton, and I was up at our cabin with my very good friend Larry Jensen, and we had gone snowshoeing, and we were sitting around by the fire, and I told him this story, and I said, Larry, heaven can't be in this invitation from President Albrecht, because if it were, I would have gotten the invitation a week before, not the day after I signed this contract. And he looked at me and he said, I thought you were smarter than that. That's not how it works. It's not about whether it's convenient, it's about whether it's the right thing to do. And that really stopped me in my tracks, caused me to think about it a different way. And I realized this was exactly what I wanted to do and was meant to do at this stage of my career. I went back to the president. I asked him for a little flexibility. The first 3 years, I was less than a full-time dean. I was on an 11-month contract rather than a 12-month contract. I'm happy to say I met all my obligations to my partners. And I was able to take advantage of this great opportunity to give back to a school that I love so much. So you asked the question, well, what was the challenge then? And I would say that the big challenge then was change, trying to bring about some change in the school. And we've had massive change in the last 10 years relative to that agenda. So I'm not initiating as much change as I did back 10 years ago, in part because we've had quite a bit of change since then.
You mentioned that you grew up on the island. So what were your early years like? Did you grow up born and raised in Logan, Utah? Did you come here from somewhere else?
I was born in Logan, Utah. I was born in the Logan LDS Hospital that no longer exists. It was down right across the street from the temple. I was born on the same 24-hour period as Dean Craig Jessup was born, and he was born in that hospital as well. So we're kind of brothers, having been born the same day in the same hospital. My parents met and married here at Utah State. Dad grew up on the island. In fact, the house that my mother and father occupy right now is about three doors down from the house that he was born in. My dad actually has passed away, but mother and dad built that house in 1968. Mother was the daughter of a dairy farmer out in Benson Ward here in Cache Valley. Dad was the student body president, and mother was the queen of the 1947 Centennial Ball. And my grandmother made the tiara that my mother wore for that ball. Although I was born here, I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Southern California. My parents moved to Southern California after I was born, and Dad went to graduate school at USC. He got a doctorate there, joined the faculty, and I went from kindergarten through high school in Pasadena. Graduated from from John Muir High School in 1968, and then went to Stanford for my freshman year. Started at Stanford. I then went on an LDS mission for 2 years to Germany, and as I mentioned, my parents built this house the year I graduated from high school. So when I got back from Germany, I was broke and homesick, and I thought there'd be nothing better than having my mother take care of me for a year. And I would go to Utah State and finish up my general education requirements, and then I'd go back and finish at Stanford. I never made it back to Stanford. I just fell in love with Utah State and decided to stay here.
That's a great story. So did your parents influence your leadership style?
I don't think there's any question that my dad influenced my leadership style, and I will tell you that he intended to do so right from the very beginning. My father, my grandfather, his father, died when he was 15 in the middle of the Depression. And my father developed a great identification with the President of the United States at the time, who was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So guess what my middle name is? Anybody have any idea? Douglas D. Anderson. Delano, that's right. Dad gave me the middle name of Delano after the great President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now I say the great President Franklin Delano Roosevelt because I was raised to believe that President Roosevelt was one of the great presidents. I still think he is, by the way. My wife was raised by a family of Republicans who didn't have that same view of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. My father-in-law actually married us, and he couldn't get the word Delano out without mispronouncing it. He said Douglas Delano Anderson. But I think my father probably would have named me Franklin Delano Anderson if my mother had allowed it. But so the idea of leadership and I would say public service was part of our family culture. Dad always emphasized that. He was a strong believer that when you're in the service of your fellow men, you're in the service of God. And he himself was very much an idealistic person. The reason why we moved back to Utah in 1968 was Dad decided to accept a commission with the United States State Department in Vietnam that year as the director of the National Institute of Administration in the Republic of South Vietnam. This was right at the height of the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive had just happened. And he was a firm believer in the idea of trying to build a civil society of accomplished leaders in the Republic of South Vietnam. When he came back from Vietnam and essentially retired from his academic career, he was elected mayor of Logan. In fact, I was his campaign manager just before I left Logan to go off to Harvard for graduate school. And so as a young boy, I was encouraged to run for, student body office. And I would say my track record was, about as many wins as losses, maybe a few more losses than wins. And so all along the way, I was either class president or student body president, or my parents emphasized scouting, and they also emphasized involvement in sports. I was a varsity baseball player in high school. I tried to go out for baseball at Stanford, and I played until the coach and I had a disagreement, which was that I thought he was good enough and he didn't, and that kind of ended that.
So you're at Utah State. You've decided that Utah State is a much better fit for you than Stanford. Did you have an idea of what you want to do for a career while you were at Utah State? And tell us about some of your leadership experiences while you were an undergraduate.
Well, again, I didn't anticipate staying at Utah State, but I fell in love with it almost immediately. I knew Cache Valley very well. I had grown up here in the summer times. As soon as baseball season was over down in Pasadena, the family always came up in the summer, and we spent the rest of the summer up here in Cache Valley. I loved being a kid in Cache Valley. It's the greatest place in the world. I loved the tubing. I loved riding horses. I loved shooting guns. I loved picking beans for 2.5 cents a pound at Del Monte. I had lots of cousins here. I just loved being here. I loved camping in the mountains, jeeping, Bear Lake. I just couldn't think of a better place to be a kid. And so I knew I was going to enjoy living here, but what I wasn't expecting was how much I was going to enjoy going to college here. I had some fabulous teachers here at Utah State. This is where I discovered economics for the first time. And many of you, if you have had parents who went to Utah State, will probably recognize the name Reed Durchie, who was my first teacher of economics and taught in the auditorium in the Eccles building, and really was an exciting teacher. But there was something that was a little odd for me, and that was whenever anybody learned that I had transferred from Stanford, they'd look at me kind of funny and say, "Why on earth did you transfer from Stanford to Utah State?" And there was sort of a subtext there. Did you have a dumb attack? Did you flunk out? Did you commit a felony? What was your problem? And it kind of bothered me because I loved it here. So I developed kind of a response that was intended to deflect the conversation and do something else. And the comment that I made was, I'd look people straight in the eye, and as seriously as I could, I would say, to get a better education. Why else would you transfer from Stanford to Utah State? And that usually brought a kind of a chuckle. But after I said it 2 or 3 times, I realized that had to be the answer. But if it was going to be the answer, it was going to depend upon me. I had to own my own education. And that kind of became a big theme for me through the rest of my career. And so I jumped in with 2 feet to the campus life here. Once again, I ran for office. I got defeated. I tried to become the academic vice president. I was badly defeated for it. But in the course of running for that office, it became known on campus that I had been the editorial page editor of the Stanford Daily as a freshman. That's the campus newspaper at Stanford. And that year, for whatever reason, the students who were running the campus newspaper, the predecessor of the Statesman, it was called the Student Life, quit. They all quit. They had a big argument with their faculty advisors and they just quit. So there was nobody to run the paper, and they opened up the election for editor-in-chief to anybody on campus, and I was encouraged to apply. And so without working a single day on the campus newspaper, I became the editor-in-chief, which is a little bit like how I became the dean of the business school, and that was a fabulous experience. I loved that experience, and I'm proud to say that it turned out to be a very, very successful year. That was 1972, 73. That year, through no, I had nothing to do with this, but I just say it because it's important. The Aggies beat the Utes of Utah here in what was Romney Stadium, 45-16, as I recall. Our quarterback, Tony Adams, who we call Touchdown Tony Adams, set an NCAA total offense record. And Tony and I were up for Achievement of the Year for the Robbins Award. The award should have gone to Tony. It went to me, but I considered Tony's achievement greater even than mine. But that was a great year. I loved the experience that we had here. And then that year also, I was able to be selected as an intern to work on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. for Utah's last Democrat senator, Senator Moss.
And that was because of your middle name.
Well, I don't know how I got the job. The guy who came up to campus to make that selection was a fellow by the name of Kem Gardner. And Kem is a very successful businessman in Salt Lake City today, runs a company called the Gardner Company. And, I will say that, and you know this, Dave, Kem has given this school, for this building, more than $1 million. So that relationship we established back in 1972 has paid off in what we're doing here today. So those experiences were priceless for me, and they did shape my thinking about leadership. I had both leadership experiences as well as I was exposed to a lot of great leaders. Yeah. Our president, the university's president at the time, Glenn Taggart, after whom the student union is named, is a hero of mine. Senator Moss was a hero of mine. That summer was not such a great year for political leadership, however. You'll remember that was the summer of the Watergate break-in. And so I was deeply disappointed by some of the leaders that I met back in Washington and saw back in Washington. But we had a wonderful experience back there, great learning experience. The interns had an opportunity every week to hear from top leaders in the government who would come in a forum like this in the Library of Congress, and we could ask them questions and so forth. There were 2 people that got standing ovations that summer, only. One was Senator Ted Kennedy, and the other was a guy by the name of L. Patrick Gray. Does anybody in the audience know who L. Patrick Gray was? L. Patrick Gray at the time was the director of the FBI. And he got a standing ovation because he said, he was in the Nixon administration, And so he was kind of playing against type. He said, you young people, speaking to us, I know it's hard for you to believe this, but I was young once. He said, you young people have something that's really precious, and that is impatience. And he said, you should use that impatience to hold us accountable and to bring about change. And that was kind of a startling thing, we thought, for him to say. It was, the era was one in which we didn't expect to hear that from an establishment figure. Now, here's the tragedy of that. The next year when, or I guess it was 2 summers later, when the hearings, the Watergate hearings were being broadcast about the break-in, and all the news was coming in about the cover-up, there was a segment that was focused on Pat Gray, because he had been given some documents by Ehrlichman and Haldeman, the president's deputy chief of staff and chief of staff, and told basically to go destroy them at his home in Connecticut. And then the question was what to do about Pat Gray, and the answer one of them said to the other was, let him twist slowly, slowly in the wind. Do you remember that phrase? Mm-hmm. I don't know if anybody else does, but that was a famous phrase back in those days. And basically what it was a sense of, real frustration about frankly, the hypocrisy of our leadership at the time. And that affected me quite deeply as well. I went back and reconstructed in my mind, and it must have been very close to the time that Pat Gray was talking to us students that he was, in fact, being instructed to destroy incriminating documents.
We want to have some time left over for all of you to ask some questions, so let me just wrap up with a couple of questions. Throughout this very diverse set of experiences, from Stanford and Utah State to running your own firm after Harvard, this internship in Washington, D.C., what are some of the leadership lessons that you've taken away?
Well, one lesson, first of all, is do the right thing. That goes back to the point about Watergate and Enron. And I think most kids who come to Utah State want to do the right thing. And I think they're taught to do the right thing from the time they're very young. We're very fortunate to be living in an area of the country where that culture is a really strong culture. But I would also say that, the world is complex, and when I was just starting out, I didn't understand the way the world worked, and that was one of the things that was a big driver for me, was this curiosity to try to understand how the world worked, and then to try to imagine the kinds of ethical challenges that you might come to grips with before they happen, so that you could to anticipate what might be a challenge to your own integrity. And so I would say number one is do the right thing. The second thing I would say is that leaders try to make the world a better place than it currently is. I think the first and probably the starting point of leadership is to see the world as it is, not as you'd like it to be, and yourself as you are, not as you might aspire to be. So seeing reality as it is and confronting that reality in a very honest and direct way is the first step. The second step is to imagine a future that never was or currently isn't. An aspiration, in other words, an audacious goal. And then to figure out a way to get from where we are to where we're trying to be. Robert Kennedy famously said, some people see the world as it is and ask why. I see the world as it never was and ask why not. I actually think you have to do both. And then you have to develop a plan for moving reality from what it is to what it could be. And that was the challenge we had here at the Huntsman School when we started out 10 years ago. What I found, I have to say, I wasn't that proud of when I became dean. In fact, that year, that first year, the Utes came back up here to Romney Stadium. That was 2006, the fall of 2006, and they beat us 48-0. And that really hurt. And so my first memo to the president was labeled, "It's 48-0." And I said, when I was a student here at Utah State, we had a good business school and it's gotten better, but it hasn't gotten better at the same pace as either Utah or BYU. And so I said, if we don't make a big change quickly, we're not going to be able to play in the same league with these guys, and I wouldn't want to be the dean that followed me. That was sort of the call to action. And I have been every single day, you asked what my day is like, every single day I ask myself, how can we get better faster? How can we get better finances? How can we get better facilities? How can we get better faculty? How can we get better students? How can we get a better brand so that we can be proud of our school and so that we can really make a difference in society by developing leaders who will make this world a better place. So I think the idea of confronting reality as it is, fashioning an aspiration, having an urgent sense of energy about making change happen, and then, of course, doing it in a way that others will want to follow you and be part of it.
Those are some great lessons. So let me just shift for my final question, and we'll open up to the audience a little bit more about the mechanics of career. So how do you hire? What are you looking for?
You know, I think this is one of the most important questions as a leader that you can have, because one of the things that I noticed in my consulting career was that we were able to help companies like Chrysler, for example, make a big shift. But if you don't hire the right people, if you don't get the right culture going, that you could have a big shift and it can then collapse. You know, there's a law of entropy in organizations, just like there is a law of entropy in nature. And what that means is that you have to continually stay at it, continually work at it. So I think the most important thing is to hire people who are going to be carriers of the culture that you're trying to create, who are going to hardwire and help you hardwire the culture into the organization so that the culture continues to focus on excellence and impact and continuous improvement and service and making a positive difference long after you're gone as a leader. And one of the things that I was most impressed by when I went back to Harvard this last semester was the culture. You know, people would ask me all the time, Doug, how's things changed since you were here before? And my answer was, I'm more impressed by what hasn't changed than what has changed. And what hadn't changed was the culture of excellence at the place. It still is really, really strong. The culture of teaching excellence, the culture of focus on student success, the culture of participation in the classrooms, the culture of colleagueship, all of that is as strong as it ever was when I was there, and even stronger. And if I have one hope for us here at the Huntsman School, is that we hardwire a culture that puts student success as our top priority and makes a strive for excellence, a desire to get better and better over time, and a desire to focus on how we can serve as an engine of growth for our community, the state, the nation, and the world. Make that culture hardwired and impervious of change so that the people that get hired here are going to be hired first and foremost for whether or not they are supporters of that kind of a culture.
So let me just last follow up. So what kind of questions would you ask? These students are going to go out over the next several years and they're going to run across lots of different opportunities for their careers. They're going to sit down in interviews. So what kind of questions do you ask in an interview when you're thinking about hiring somebody?
Well, Stephen Covey, you know, Dave, he spent his last 2.5 years of his life as the first John M. Huntsman Professor of Leadership here at the Huntsman School of Business. And Stephen was a great friend and a great model for me. And Stephen always suggested that if you want a great career, you start first and foremost by asking yourself, what are your strengths? What are you passionate about? what's the world's great need that you can help serve, and what is your conscience telling you? And so he would advise people when they were going to apply for jobs to do their homework and figure out what was the company's need and how could you fit there? What kind of a contribution could you make to the corporation? So I try to assess when I'm interviewing somebody whether they have a service orientation. You know, are they climbing the ladder of success because they have a really narrow definition of what their purpose is? Or do they have a sense of purpose that goes beyond self? Are they looking to be aligned behind a great and noble purpose that they can contribute to that's bigger than themselves? So I am probing to try to find out whether that contribution ethic is a sincerely held point of view from the people that we hire. I'm more interested in that than talent. I let other people in the Huntsman School try to figure out whether the folks are talented. I assume that they don't come to me. They don't get to an interview with me without being talented. So I'm really looking for their values.
Great. So we have about 10, 15 minutes left, and we've got people in the back with some mics. I'll open it up to the audience for any questions for Dean Anderson on leadership. Raise your hands and it'll come to you. And if you don't ask questions, I'll just keep asking them. You don't want that.
What are some of your favorite books that you've read on leadership that you would recommend to us?
Well, you know, it's interesting. There are so many books that are about leadership, but they aren't necessarily leadership books. There's a gazillion books on leadership out there, but I sometimes like to find inspiration in novels and in plays and in history books. So, for example, the Huntsman scholars this year are going to go to England, and I get to go with them. Somebody said the dean, needs to go with them. The fact is that I get to go to England with them, and I'm going to spend a day with them talking about a great book. It's a play by Robert Bolt called Man for All Seasons. It was made into a movie in the mid-1960s, starring Paul Scofield, who won the Academy Award. It's about Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, who was Chancellor of England. At the time, Henry VIII passed the law of supremacy through Parliament that divided the Church of England from the Catholic Church and the Pope of Rome so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. It's a great book. There's so many leadership lessons in that book that I encourage you to read it. It's a quick read, and to see the movie, which is wonderfully made. Now, interestingly enough, there's a more recent book about the Henry Thomas More conflict that involves Thomas Cromwell, who was another important actor in that scene. It's called Wolf Hall. Have any of you heard about Wolf Hall? Okay, Wolf Hall is by a woman by the name of Hilary Mantel. She has 2 books, Wolf Hall and Bringing Up the Bodies. These are novels, but she reimagines the whole Thomas More Henry scenario from a completely different perspective, from the perspective of Thomas Cromwell, who is an evil villain in Robert Bolt's play, and her turns out to be quite a sympathetic character in Hilary Mantel's rendering. It's so interesting to read both perspectives, and I'm not prepared to give up either. I love them both. I love both representations because they share different aspects of possibility that causes you to think about the world in different ways. It goes back to what I was talking about earlier about seeing the world as it is. And I think it's important to try to see the world through other people's eyes. And that's what these 2 books, in contrast to each other, do. They challenge you to see the world in different eyes. right at that time, by the way, Machiavelli was writing his famous book about leadership called The Prince, which again is another classic book on leadership that I'd encourage you all to read. Basically, Machiavelli was famous for the dictum, the ends justify the means. And so you have to ask yourself the question, do the ends justify the means? And I was stumped by that question when I was your age. I really wasn't sure how to answer it. In fact, I applied for the Rhodes Scholarship when I was a senior at Utah State University, and I got nominated from the state of Utah, and I went down to Caltech for the finals, and there were 12 of us, and 4 of us were going to get selected to be Rhodes Scholars to go over to Oxford for 2 years. And I made some sort of comment about, I was asked a question, I said, well, that seems sort of Machiavellian. And the guy who was running the interview panel said, well, what did you think about Machiavelli? And I said, well, you mean, what do I think in terms of his intention for writing the book? My understanding was he was trying to ingratiate himself with the Medicis after having been thrown out of power. No, he said, no. Do you believe that the ends justify the means? And I mumbled something. I was kind of not very coherent. But that's a question that has stayed with me for a long time. And I remember when I got to graduate school at Harvard, I asked one of my major professors that question to see how he would respond. And his answer was, if the ends don't justify the means, what does? And that took me in a completely different way. So I give you those examples of literature, but there are so many others. Have any of you read the novel The Remains of the Day? Remains of the Day? That was also made into a movie. Is it Ishikawa that wrote that book? It's a wonderful novel by a Japanese guy who was raised in England about a butler serving in a great house in England in the interwar period. And his boss, the lord of the manor who he serves, happens to be very favorably disposed to the Germans and is trying to help find a way so that England can have a better relationship with Germany right at the time that Hitler is rising into power. And the sad fact of the case was this lord of the manor, along with a lot of other British noble people, kind of got headed down the wrong track with respect to Hitler, and they were on the wrong side of history, let me put it that way. And yet this butler felt that it was his most noble and highest aspiration to be the perfect butler. The reason I cite that as a potential leadership lesson is because the author of the book basically was creating the idea that we are all, to a certain extent, butlers. And the question is, who are we serving? And are the purposes of the people that we are serving really the purposes that we ought to be serving? And again, it goes to the core issues of leadership, which is, who are you? Who am I? What is the fundamental purpose that I exist to serve? And the importance of always examining that question.
Great. We have time for one question, 2 questions.
How have you seen the typical student that comes through the John Huntsman School of Business evolve over the last 10 years, in your tenure as dean?
Great question. Thanks for that. I love the way in which you all are approaching your studies these days. I do get a sense that there's a greater sense of aspiration in the Huntsman School of Business, a greater sense of owning your own education, a sense of energy and enthusiasm about the possibility that you could create and shape your own destiny. And I see this changing. I think it was there. I think it was latent before, but I think the culture that we're creating is both attracting a higher standard, better students, and I think it's expecting more of the students. You know, we have the Dare Mighty Things motto up. That wasn't here 10 years ago. Our faculty are, I believe, setting a higher expectation in their teaching. I'll just give you one example of that. We recruited a wonderful department head of our School of Accountancy in 2008. His name is Dr. Larry Walther. Some of you may have taken his class. Dr. Walther came from the University of Texas in Arlington. The first class that Dr. Walther gave, he flunked 40% of the class. And he was disappointed in the response of the students. The next semester, he gave more A's than he had ever given before, and he wasn't adjusting his standards. What adjusted was the students' rise to the expectation. And he tells the story of standing up at the beginning of that second semester and saying, now look, this is stuff you're going to have to know. These understandings, this capacity is something you're going to have to develop before the end of the term. And if you don't, you're going to fail. And some kid in the front row turns around and said, and he's not kidding. He was there for the second time because he had failed the first time. What Dr. Walther says is that students at Utah State University are capable of being as good as any students in the country, but they have to understand what the standards are, and they have to own the responsibility of doing the hard work to get there. And I think the students are evolving that way. I'm really very, very proud of all of you and what you're doing.
Ben, let's have you ask the last question.
In your experience of hiring so many employees, what are some of the characteristics that you've seen of the leaders the employees that you've hired that have become leaders? What are some of the characteristics that made them an effective leader?
It is true that we've hired a lot of people here at the Huntsman School in the last 10 years. When I became dean, there were 72 full-time faculty members. Only 22 of those 72 still are with us. In other words, 50 are gone. And I will tell you, it's been a refreshing change. We had, at the time I hired, started out here 37 staff people, and only 7 of those staff are still here. We have increased our faculty by 1/3. We've added 24 additional faculty over that period of time, and we've hired 23 additional staff people. So we have 60 staff now and 96 faculty. So 77% of the faculty are new since July 1st, 2006, and 88% of the staff are new since July 1st, 2006. The people who succeed here at the Huntsman School are people who will live our values and who will be carriers of our values, who will express those values in virtually everything they do and the way in which they act. They will model those values. You know, Gandhi famously said, be the change that you want to see in the world. That means you've got to model the behavior and exemplify that behavior. So what Dr. Larry Walther did was modeling that kind of behavior, setting high expectations, holding people accountable for them, allowing them to get the support that they need so that they can reach the challenges that we place. We say any mistake made leaning in the direction of student success is a forgivable mistake at the Huntsman School. Any mistake leaning in the direction of faculty or administrative convenience may or may not be a forgivable mistake. And we expect people to live those values, and we hold them accountable. So those who succeed are those who live the values.
Great. Thanks very much, Doug.
Thank you. Great pleasure being with you.